Today is the 13th, I
Yes.
think.
Hello, I'm David Lubinsky at ISIR Annual Conference 2012 in San Antonio. And I am interviewing Richard Heyer as the Distinguished Contributor interview for this year's ISIR. Rich, it feels like, talking to an old friend. Rich and I got together over Skype, and the agenda was to put together an outline for the interview. And we really never got to it because after about 50 minutes on Skype, I said, Rich, I think we just did the interview. So why don't you just start out by saying a little bit about your early influences, your mentors.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Well, I went to graduate school at Johns Hopkins, started there in 1971 and left in 1975. And I went and really began there with an interest in personality. And my dissertation advisor was Bob Hogan, who most of you probably don't know because he's a personality guy, not an intelligence guy. But that's how I started at Hopkins. And in 1971 was also the year Julian Stanley started the famous study of mathematically and scientifically precocious kids. And I worked on that as well. So Julian was kind of a quasi-mentor. I was at the first talent search. I passed out pencils. I chatted with the kids. And I think that was one of the earliest influences that moved me more toward intelligence and away from personality. So I left Hopkins in '75 and took my first job in the intramural research program at the National Institute of Mental Health. At that time, it was separate from NIH. And I was hired by a man named David Rosenthal, who many of you in the genetics area will recognize as the principal investigator of the Denmark or the Danish adoption studies of schizophrenia. And at Hopkins, it was really a tremendously intellectual experience at Hopkins. All the faculty were fabulous. In my year, there were only a dozen graduate students. It was a very small group. We all knew each other. We all liked each other. We all spent a lot of time and learned. We spent a lot of time with each other and learned from each other, and became kind of generalist in a way. And then when I went to NIMH, this was really an interesting environment, the intramural research program. And this is where I learned about genetics from David Rosenthal. He was really an interesting mentor, very nice person, very gracious man, very low key. And he told me, I came from Hopkins. I knew about multivariate statistics, and he wanted me to work on the personality data from the Denmark adoption study with the MMPI, and I was talking about regression equations. And he said, look, in this business, if you want to convince anybody of anything, you got to get the data down to a 2x2 chi-square. So any fool can see, look, there are more schizophrenics in this group than that group. So forget the multivariate stuff. He says, if you win a Nobel Prize, that would be great. I would really enjoy that, he said. But just keep it simple. And then the other influence at NIMH was my office was right next door to Monty Buxbaum, who was in the biological psychiatry branch, which had just been renamed the biological psychiatry branch. It had been known as the adult psychiatry branch. But based on largely on the Denmark adoption studies of schizophrenia, there was an internal struggle within NIMH intramural research program. The psychiatrists wanted to go more biological. They won, it became the adult psychiatry branch, and a number of analyst types left NIMH. So I was there at kind of a very interesting time. And then I was there for 4 years, and then after that I had 2 job offers. One at Case Western in the psychology department, Doug and Cleve Gilmore and others. Very friendly, very pleasant offer. And the other was in the medical school at Brown University in the Department of Psychiatry. And at that moment, the fateful decision was made. I went to Brown, and from that point forward, I was in medical schools. And I was at Brown for 5 years, where by far the greatest influence was meeting my wife, Barbara, who's in the back. And I also had an interesting mentor at Brown. It was the chairman of the psychiatry department, a man named Nate Epstein. He was a fabulous psychiatrist, very much an academic, very much interested in research, and taught me a lot about administration because I had an administrative job. At the Brown Medical School, there was no tenure. So all the faculty were employed by the local hospitals. And I was the director of psychology at the local psychiatric hospital. And so this is all very interesting preparation. And after Brown, Bucksbaum had moved from NIMH to University of California at Irvine, where the Department of Psychiatry was getting its own PET scanner. It was about 1985. And I said, geez, access to a PET scanner. This is pretty good. So we moved to Irvine, and that's where we have been ever since.
Interesting. You know, I know you much prefer to talk about the future rather than the past because you're more interested in it. And you just finished a series of lectures on psychology. How did that come about? And
a couple of years ago, I was invited, along with several other people, to give keynote addresses at a for-profit education conference. So there were about 1,200 educators in the audience, and I was invited to talk about brain imaging studies of intelligence. And apparently at that meeting there was a recruiter for a company called The Teaching Company. Some of you may know The Teaching Company. They do something called the Great Courses. And they contacted me after the meeting and asked if I would be interested in doing a course on intelligence. And these are courses that would be videotaped. And so this was a 2-year audition development period. And just not even a week ago, I was up in their studios in Virginia, and I recorded 18 lectures in 5 days covering key topics in intelligence, starting with what is intelligence, to how do we measure intelligence, to the genetic story, to the brain imaging story. The last lecture was called the IQ pill, and we talked about increasing intelligence. So it was kind of a fun thing to do. It allowed me to get a kind of updated on the field, because it was a very research-oriented course. And ironically, because I have been in medical schools, I have never taught an undergraduate course. And so I've never taught a course in intelligence or really anything else. So this is actually a lot of work to put this together, but it was a good refresher for me. And I came almost directly from there to here with a brief stop at home, but it really reinvigorated my feeling that the field of intelligence is really in very good shape internally. Its relationship to other branches of science is more problematic, but it's moving in the right direction on all fronts. And it's really, it's a very exciting activity to be engaged in, and you're all really lucky to be working on issues in intelligence, I think. As other people have said at this meeting, there are a few things that are more exciting than trying to understand human intelligence.
Rich, how has the field of intelligence changed since you were a graduate student?
Well, I left graduate school in 1975, and the big question about intelligence in 1975, the argument was, is there a genetic component to intelligence or not? That was it. Am I right about that? Yeah. Is there a genetic component or not? The world was just beginning to get the idea that genetics was important in schizophrenia. The Denmark adoption studies, I think, were first announced, I think, at a meeting in Puerto Rico in 1968 or 1969, a meeting like this. And one of the psychiatrists in the audience, who was a proponent of an environmental theory of schizophrenia, had a heart attack right in the meeting. It's not fatal. I mean, this is, I mention this only to give you the idea of how controversial a genetic component or not, let alone the kinds of things we heard about today in this fabulous world of behavioral genetics and the technology pushing this forward. So that was the status when I left graduate school in '75. There was no brain imaging. I never heard of brain imaging when I was a graduate student. So PET scanning, the first PET scanner commercially was sold to the National Institutes of Mental Health around 1980, and just as I was leaving. And MRI scans were 15 years in the future. Cognitive psychologists started to use MRI, functional MRI. Around 1995 is when it really started to catch on. So we had published the first PET scanning study of intelligence in 1988, just to show you how far ahead we were at that point in brain imaging. And so it's completely different now. We're not, I mean, we're talking about specific connections in the brain and the neurotransmitters that support them that are the source of individual differences in intelligence. And we're kind of arguing about, well, is it this one or that one, not is there a genetic component or not. So it's advanced dramatically. So it's about 40 years from graduate school to now. You know, it's one professional lifetime. Enormous change, absolutely enormous.
So Rich, what do you see as the key future directions and research questions?
In 1990, I wrote an editorial for the journal Intelligence. It was called The End of Intelligence Research. Deliberately ambiguous, the end of intelligence research. And what I meant was, at the end of research on intelligence, what will we have learned? What problem will we have solved? And in that editorial, I argued in 1990 that every psychology department needed its own brain imaging equipment. And I was completely ridiculed for this because brain imaging equipment, of course, is millions of dollars. Psychology departments historically didn't have that kind of money. But that, I thought, was the future. Because every one of you who studies intelligence, without exception, whether you know it or not, is studying the brain. You know, if you're a psychometrician, you are using psychometric instruments to make indirect inferences about individual differences in the brain. If you're studying genetics, you're studying genetic influences on the brain. You cannot get, you know, earlier we heard about 4 psychologists with different philosophical views and how they all shared the common view that spatial reasoning had a unique impact. Well, no matter what your orientation is about intelligence, you must agree that it has something to do with the brain. That's what's common.